And I'll offer a plug from that, though it's a bit of shameless promotion because actually I will be the presenter. I'll be presenting on recent research that I've done with a student of mine that puts the unique soils of the Albany Pine Bush into a broader perspective. I'll show that New York's geology includes far more extensive deposits of deep sandy soils than we previously recognized. And this has implications for our understanding of pine barrens and sand plains of the past, but also of the future and how we can restore them. So that will be on March 16th, hopefully in person and also online. So please stay tuned. So now back to our presentation tonight. As you can see on the title there, Eastern Whippoorwill and Ecosystem Health in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve by Neil Gifford. And so I'm gonna let our preserve's field ecologist and entomologist, Amanda Dillon, introduce our speaker. So Dillon, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Really looking forward to your lecture in March. So thank you everyone so much for joining. Sorry about our last minute change. The roads got kind of nasty this afternoon, so we figured this was safer for everybody. So thank you so much for tuning in. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Neil Gifford, our conservation director. So just to give you a little background in case you are unfamiliar with this guy, which seems unlikely, Neil Gifford earned his associates in applied science from Paul Smith's studying environmental science. And then he went on to earn a BA and an MA, also in environmental science, from Plattsburgh State University. All of his education and experience is really centered around fire ecology and birds. So I'm sure he's going to hate talking about whippoorwills in the preserve tonight. He's been the conservation director at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, or he's for 25 years, 26 in April. So in that position, he's kind of the lead scientist for the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, responsible for research and management for the commission. So Neil, thank you so much for lecturing for us tonight, and I'll hand it over to you. Oh, sorry, I do want to mention, if you have any questions, please go ahead and pop them in the Q&A, and we will address your questions after Neil's presentation.
Great. Thank you, Dylan, who is also a co-author with me on all of this work, as is Steve Campbell, our conservation biologist. The three of us have been trying to follow whippoorwills for the last several years. But before I begin and start talking about this amazing place and this fascinating little bird, I first need to recognize that the preserve's globally rare fire-dependent inland pine barrens and the species it supports are largely the result of pre-colonial indigenous fire stewardship by the Moheganac and Haudenosaunee First Nation peoples and cultures that live on today within and beyond their ancestral lands. The opportunity to restore, celebrate, respect, and enjoy this living piece of our shared experience is a great honor and a humbling responsibility. Every place and every species has a story, and I hope you enjoy tonight's. So by way of an outline, just to give you a sense of what we're going to cover this evening, we're going to start off talking a little bit about whippoorwill ecology and biology. Eastern whippoorwill is the full name of the species. We'll talk a little bit about pine barrens and, of course, the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. And then we'll talk about restoring ecosystem health, how we're doing that, what that means. And then look at what the Eastern whippoorwill is telling us, both from what we're learning through our community scientists. This is a pretty excellent team of volunteers that since 2007 have been helping us detect and monitor the presence or absence of Eastern whippoorwill, utilizing the preserve's trail system. And then we'll talk about the work that Steve, Dylan, and I have been doing to study the birds a little bit more closely in the preserve. Let's see if this works. Uh-oh. Oh no. Oh wait, there it is. Hopefully this will work. If you go in the preserve or anywhere to look for Eastern whippoorwills, this is what you'll see, this black screen. But hopefully this is what you'll hear. Eastern whippoorwill has to be one of the most enigmatic sounds of nature, right up there with, from a Hollywood perspective, with loons and red-tailed hawks. Even though they'll frequently show you, a bald eagle flying, you'll frequently hear a red-tailed hawk. But, the sound of a loon, the sound of a red-tailed hawk, the sound of a whippoorwill is really, a truly charismatic and enigmatic sound of the woods. And here's what eastern whippoorwills look like. They are extremely cryptic little birds. And you'll notice how it's sitting on this log. One of the unique things about whippoorwills is they don't typically perch across a branch like your typical bird, a cardinal, a robin, a blue jay, a chickadee. They perch along a branch. And that's mostly for camouflage. So they will kind of blend in when they're roosting during the day. But they're known as whips, goat suckers, and nightjars, eastern whippoorwills. As you could tell from that song, that song is kind of jarring and it will jar through the night. We can attest that when they are singing and they are nearby, it is pretty much impossible to hear anything else, even traffic noise in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. They're about 8.5 to 10.5 inches long. And they're also called goat suckers, as you'll see in a minute, why that is. And they're a group, the eastern whippoorwill is goat suckers and nightjars are a group of birds that includes other species like common nighthawks, lesser nighthawks, whippoorwill, and Tuckwill's widow. And you can hear, there are places in Long Island where you can hear all three: Tuckwill's widow, eastern whippoorwill, and whippoorwill. The birds themselves are extremely cryptic, as are their nests. And they don't really build much of a nest. They simply blend into the foliage. Let me go, if I can go back here. You notice the coloration on this bird when it is sitting on the ground. They are ground nesters, and they just lay their eggs on the oak leaf litter. They don't really make much of a nest. And when they're sitting on those eggs, it's pretty much impossible to see until you're standing on top of them. They will aggressively defend their young, and their young are pretty precocial when they hatch. So even though they're ground nesters, the birds will aggressively defend their young, but also the young within a matter of hours are really able to run around and try and escape any predator or threat that may approach. Much of eastern whippoorwill's biology is really tied to the lunar cycles, which is really quite amazing. Realize these are birds, right? These are not bats. So eastern whippoorwill, they don't have echolocation to locate things at night. They are visual hunters. So they actually are depending on moonlight and starlight to be able to feed. Their most common way of feeding, they actually behave much more like a flycatcher. It's called sallying. So they will sit on a branch or along a branch and looking up to the sky and utilizing that background light to look for moths like that Luna moth that I have staged on top of the moon there. Not a Luna moth, that's Cecropia, I'm sorry. Dylan, if you could see me, you're in the room. There you are. So that is a Cecropia, I believe. But they're like a flycatcher. So they're sitting on the branch looking against the background light of the sky and then flying out, 10 to 15 feet to grab a moth or any other flying insect that they may see. They will also feed on the ground and along logs where they'll perch and eat things like ants and beetles and things. But typically, they're catching primarily moths and other flying insects at night based on what they can see. And what's interesting is if you look at the close-up of the head up here, they have very large eyes, and they actually have a special reflective lens on the back of their eye to maximize its ability to collect light in low light conditions. But also notice those, we call them whiskers, but they're actually rictal bristles. And if you look at the bird and look how small his beak is, if you look at that upper right-hand picture, looks like they have a very small mouth. You might think, well, how could they catch a moth with that thing? But then look at the one yawning in the middle of the day, and you can see just how much that mouth opens. And this is why we think they used to be called goat suckers, because the wives' tale, the old used to be, that they would latch onto cows or goats and drink milk with that giant mouth. Of course, they don't do that; they're purely insectivorous. But that mouth actually opens up quite large. And if you look at those rictal bristles along either side of that upper mandible, it actually works like a catcher's mitt, increasing the size of the mouth and being able to increasing their ability to catch moths. Now, if you've ever handled moths, you might realize that the moths and butterflies in particular are full of fuzzy scales, and all that stuff can accumulate on those rictal bristles. So if you look at the close-up of the toenail to the left of the bird's face, if you notice that toenail, it's got a comb built into it, got little bristles on it. Nobody knows exactly what those are for. It is generally thought that they are used for grooming, probably grooming those rictal bristles, keeping them clean so they can be effective. But also there's some thought that they're used to remove ectoparasites. So it makes sense actually in in some of these habitats that a bird would have an ability to, has its own tick removal system built in. There's also the other line of thinking is that long toenail with that comb on top of it is helping them latch on and grab onto the branches and logs where they perch. They don't, if eastern whippoorwills don't have, their legs are short little stubby things, their feet are not very, don't seem very strong at all. So there's also a thought that claw may help them hold on to things. But either way, it is a pretty unique adaptation on their toes. Again, you can see that large mouth. The other neat thing about whippoorwills that totally fascinated me is the fact that they time the hatching of their eggs with the full moon. So they will arrive, set up their territories, pair bond, and lay their eggs so that they hatch about 10 days before the full moon. Again, that full moon is giving off an awful lot of light. And any time in our sampling, we're looking at the moon to be visible and more than half illuminated because it brightens up the night sky. And if the sky is brighter, it increases the opportunity for the birds to catch insects, to feed themselves and their young when those young hatch. That's a pretty unique and interesting, to me anyway, evolutionary adaptation that they time, lots of birds time their migrations and annual cycles with photoperiod, but in this case, whippoorwills are utilizing the phases of the moon to time their biology. And we tried looking at, last thing with this slide, if you look at the close-up of the bird's face, you notice how it's got these raised nostrils. It's not most birds, you can see right through the nostrils on their upper mandible, but whippoorwills have this, their nostrils kind of projected out. I'm not sure what that's all about. So, but if anybody has any idea, you can talk about that with the Q&A at the end. And lastly, the habitat of whippoorwills is generally much more open forested habitat than we typically think of as forest. And typically this is pretty open canopied oak and pine forests and relatively dry sites. But really it doesn't matter, it doesn't seem to matter as much what the species composition of that forest canopy is. Could be jack pine, could be oak, could be red pine, pitch pine, or a mix thereof, but really it's about the open canopy. And that open canopy is important for a couple of reasons, we think. One, again, lets a lot more light in, right? Which is why there's such an amazing diversity of plants on the ground floor, on the forest floor. But also it's helping them maximize their ability to fly around and catch insects at night and to be able to see. Eastern whippoorwills used to be incredibly common. They're still considered somewhat common, but their breeding range is pretty large across most of the upper Midwest and northeastern United States and southern Canada. They winter along the Gulf Coast and down into Central America. And eastern whippoorwills, like too many birds, if you've looked at the State of the Birds report that came out in 2022, it's interesting, more than 60% of all birds are in pretty significant decline. Look at the population trends over the last 50 years. The only group of birds in North America that seem to be doing better are birds that depend on wetlands. So ducks, geese, shorebirds, marsh birds populations are generally doing better, but overall, all other birds, including some pretty common species, have experienced dramatic declines. And that's certainly true for the eastern whippoorwill. The graph here is showing the 60% decline. This is from the Breeding Bird Survey from the USGS. This goes from 1966 to 2021. And keep in mind that the Breeding Bird Survey is typically a daytime survey, so you wouldn't expect to see a lot of birds, but the decline given standard effort is very real. And if you drill into the background map here, it's based on ecoregions, but it's looking at the trend data from the Breeding Bird Survey from the U.S. Geological Survey. And the dark red areas are areas where they're in significant decline. The orange is a slight decline, and the blue are areas where they're increasing. And what's interesting about the blue areas, historically, those were the edges of the species range. And while it's increasing in those areas, if you look at the numbers, that it's increasing from almost nothing to a little bit more than nothing. Whereas every place else, it's declining from highly abundant, relatively common occurrence to becoming less and less common. And compare that trend, for example, of the eastern whippoorwill with the trend for the American robin, with a range wide across North America. Again, even robins are declining. You think about how common robins are, but you look at the number of birds seen per root in the breeding bird survey. You're looking at from mid 20s to the mid 30s over time, whereas in the eastern whippoorwill you're looking at about a tenth of a bird per root in 2021. So the birds are certainly in decline, which is one of the reasons why we're concerned about it. But not just range wide, also in New York State, and this data is thanks to both of the last two New York State breeding bird atlas projects. There's currently breeding atlas number 3 is ongoing now. I think it's in its 4th or 5th year of surveys. And the blocks on this map from the 1980s to 2000s represent atlas blocks and people reporting whether or not a whippoorwill, in this case, was a possible breeder, a probable breeder, or a confirmed breeder. The atlas defines all of those, but a pretty significant decline across the state from the 1980s to the 2000s. It is all states in the country have these lists of species of greatest conservation need mandated by Congress, and the idea is that if we work to protect these declining species, we can hopefully preclude them from needing to be listed as threatened or endangered. In New York State, they've refined their list more than most states, where we have high priority species of greatest conservation need, and the whippoorwill is one of those species. It's considered an at-risk species by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Partners in Flight keeps track of a rarity score, a watch list score. It goes from 0 to 20. And currently the whippoorwill has got a score of 14 out of 20. So it's just into the red zone for the Partners in Flight project. And I believe that is Dylan's hand holding that magnificent eastern whippoorwill that we caught behind the Ferguson in 2019. Whippoorwills are actually one of the common denominators across the archipelago of pine barrens in the Northeast. They are still relatively common on Long Island and the Jersey Pinelands, but even upstate New York, up in Clintonville and Altona, the Jack Pine and Pitch Pine barrens, as well as all of our sister barrens in Massachusetts, the Montague Plains, but also Concord, Ossipee, and Waterboro, all still have whippoorwills. I'm not sure about the Hudson Highlands and the gunks, but whippoorwills are one of the species that makes all these pine barrens. And pine barrens seem to be a preferred habitat. And like the picture shows there, and if you've been in high quality pine barrens, they are indeed not forests. They are almost a savanna-like gestalt where the canopy is very, very open. These are all globally rare, isolated ecosystems with unique species assemblages. All of them are incredibly important as biodiversity hotspots, particularly for early successional or young forest wildlife species, but especially shrubland birds and pollinator insects. And pretty much all of these barrens now are maintained exclusively through active management, much like what we're doing in the Albany Pine Bush. The Albany Pine Bush is considered the best remaining example of an inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And it's also a national natural landmark, a New York State bird conservation area, and an Audubon important bird area. And it is, as many of you probably know, it's also the type locality of the very first place that the Carner blue butterfly was identified from. So it's called Carner blue because Carner was a little rail station in Albany Pine Bush. And all of these pine barrens are fire dependent. And really, pine barrens owe their existence really to two factors. One, of course, is they are relics of soils, and almost all pine barrens persisted because they're on pretty nutrient poor, extremely dry soils, like glacial outwash sands, like wind deposited sands like the pine bush. But also, they are a relic of indigenous fire stewardship. The more I read, here are three resources, but the more I read, the more I talk to folks, it's pretty clear that prior to European colonization and the attempted genocide of Native people were burning all across the North American continent. Frequently, it was their primary land management tool for a host of reasons, and that persisted for at least a couple thousand years prior to European colonization. And we try and mimic that today with our prescribed fire program. But really, if we want to understand these ecosystems and improve ecosystem health, there's really two lines of evidence that we have to try and get a glimpse of what these systems were like in the past when they were in their heyday and fully viable and much, much larger than they are today. For example, the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, the barrens here were at least 25,000 acres in size originally. Today, we're protecting 3,400 acres. The postage stamp and fragmented relic of what it used to be. But at one point, it was immense and it was extremely viable. And we know, for example, from pollen and charcoal cores taken from the Pine Barrens Vernal Pond in Carter Barrens East behind the Discovery Center, that oak and pine have dominated this landscape for at least 6,600 years. And if you look at the dark bands within that core, there's also an extremely frequent fire history for pretty much that whole time. So for 6,000 years, fire has been an active force helping to create and perpetuate ecosystem viability for pine barrens. So ecosystem viability for us, and as the law dictates, is heavily about managing a viable ecosystem with fire. So fire is a fundamental ecological process. But the other line of evidence we have for ecosystem viability really are the rare wildlife that depend on this system. And there's a wide variety of them. That includes, of course, the corner blue, but a number of other butterflies, moths, reptiles, and amphibians, and birds. The preserve is now 3,401 acres as of about a week ago and growing. And this map here illustrates the protected preserve lands in the darkest green shading. As you can see, it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle in progress. We're working on building this puzzle and we're not done yet. We've protected 3,401 acres, but there are still close to 2,000 acres illustrated here in this line, brighter green, brighter green, that we are actively working with willing landowners to try and protect and add to the preserve. And our goals for managing the preserve are primarily ecological as well as programmatic. Ecological goal, as dictated by the Environmental Conservation Law, Article 46, that created the preserve and the commission, is all about being explicit to managing a viable pitch pine scrub oak barren, managing it with fire. No individual species is mentioned in the law or in our mandate, including the Carner blue, which was listed as endangered in New York State when the law that created the preserve and the commission was. But additionally to managing viable pine barrens, we want to manage linkages and buffers between and against the protected land, as well as significant cultural and other environmental resources. And programmatically, we want to do things like this. We want to maintain and enhance public access to the preserve and expand education and outreach efforts for recreation and education. But our goals are primarily ecological. And that means that we're taking a system-based approach. We're not looking, we don't specifically manage really for any individual species. We do a few things for Carner blues because they're endangered. But really our goal is managing to restore the composition, structure, and function of the world's best remaining example of an inland pitch pine scrub oak barren. And as this picture illustrates, in its best fully restored form, it's a savanna within a savanna. You have an open canopy of pitch pine and scattered oak trees. There's an understory open canopy of scrub oak. And then amongst all that scrub oak, which is kind of all the little bushes you see here in this picture, are this incredible diversity of grasses and wildflowers, many of which are actually prairie grasses and wildflowers, including the things that the Carner blue and other rare insects do. But this is also the habitat of some pretty unique birds. Restoring ecosystem function, restoring ecosystem health for us is really about prescribed fire, but we realized through our adaptive management program and our research that fire alone cannot restore the system back to what it was. And I liken it to our own health, particularly people can relate, you might be able to relate if you've been sick, particularly now we're coming out of the COVID pandemic. But if you're really sick, what it takes to get you well again is a whole lot different than what it takes to maintain your health if you're feeling well. So for us, that means we're utilizing prescribed fire, but in the restoration phase, we're utilizing prescribed fire with a bunch of other tools. tree cutting, getting rid of invasive plants, getting rid of overabundant plants, some limited herbicide work, and a bunch of mowing work. All of that is setting the stage so that we can actually put safe and effective prescribed fire on the ground to really restore the ecosystem. And if you're familiar with wetlands, I liken fire in pine barrens to hydrology in wetlands. Fire is really the catalyst for everything that's happening within pine barrens. And of course, we do an awful lot of seeding, particularly in this case, our stewardship director, Joel Hecht, on a tractor there with the seed drill, planting a variety of plants in what had been a monoculture of non-native invasive trees that have been removed. So we use a whole bunch of tools. And ultimately, we'll maintain the system with pretty frequent, low intensity, low severity. But ultimately, the question we're asking is, are we advancing ecosystem health? And we really go back through those two lines of evidence that we had to try and figure out what ecosystem health for this system means. So we're looking to reestablish the appropriate fire regime. That just means putting the right kind of fire on the ground at the right time to get the desired effects. And looking at the distribution and abundance of the wildlife that depends on this ecosystem as barometers of whether or not the ecosystem is functioning. If you think about, every species has its niche, and that niche is incredibly complicated. And you add that up with a whole bunch of species. Understanding that ecosystem function means that all of those species can do well. So the distribution and their abundance of the species that truly depend on pine barrens should be doing well and improving over time as we're managing the preserve. So they're telling us a lot. These species are telling us a lot about the health of the ecosystem. So we've been working since 1991 to put fire on the ground, and we've pretty much done a pretty good job of reestablishing the appropriate fire regime. To date, we've burned a little over 3,600 acres since 1991. Of course, many of those units have experienced fire multiple times, but the overall footprint now is about 1,500 acres of the 3,400 acre preserve that we've actually managed with fire. I apologize, I know this is a little bit hard to read, but the various colors here just relate to the year that these sites burned. But overall, we've hit over half of the preserve with respect. Similarly, of course, Corner blue is endangered, so we have state and federal mandates to try and recover our local population of this species. You've probably seen this slide before. But the Corner blue meta population in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve far exceeds any of the thresholds established by state and federal recovery plans and our own recovery plan. We set a target population every year. We want to see the butterfly numbers around or above 7,500. And we've been bouncing around the July brood, which is the blue dots here, between 10 to 15,000 butterflies a year. And that's an extremely conservative estimate of the butterfly abundance in the preserve, because we're only sampling less than 20% of the occupied habitat in the preserve. When we first started managing the preserve in 91, we had maybe 13 acres of Corner blue habitat. Now we have close to 800 acres of Corner blue butterfly habitat. So clearly the butterfly is telling us that ecosystem health is improving, but the Corner blue is really a very limited window to only look at one species. You're really not, we can't learn a whole lot. We learn a lot, but we can't learn everything about ecosystem health and how the system is doing from one species. So we do look at a variety of other species. I'm only showing you the birds here, but we've looked at moths, butterflies. Dylan has done an unbelievable job identifying native bees in the preserve. I believe she's up to over 190 species of native bees in the Albany Pine Bush. It does not include honeybees or other invasive non-native bees. Moths, bees, ants. We studied reptiles and amphibians, but we also spent a fair amount of time looking at the bird community, in particular because it's relatively inexpensive and straightforward, or more feasible anyway, to study birds over time. And this suite of 6 species in particular, we've been monitoring their distribution and abundance, and they're doing quite well in the preserve. And we anticipated that these species would do well, and all of these but the bluebird are declining dangerously quickly throughout their range. I was surprised to learn that field sparrows populations range-wide are declining unbelievably fast, but also eastern towhees and brown thrashers, prairie warblers, and kingbirds. But we have very large and robust populations in the preserve. what we didn't expect was that we would start hearing whippoorwills at night in the preserve and the places we're managing. And really, the first birds were detected by our community scientists and our seasonal staff in 2007. And since then, the birds have been detected in 2008 and 9, 16, 17, 18, and 19, as well as in 2021 and 2022. Now, our community scientists, this is a group of dedicated volunteers that have been helping us utilizing our point count stations at night to monitor eastern whippoorwills, using standardized protocols for the Northeast Night Jar Network. And the protocols that are used at a number of sites, standard methods, and then we centralize the data. Dylan manages this program. And thanks to these volunteers since 2007, they're there, all of our volunteers. Hopefully some of them are on the webinar with us tonight. They have detected birds in 4 areas of the 6 that we've been surveying. We have not detected whippoorwills in any of these years in the Rapp Road Barrens or in Blueberry Hill, but they have been relatively consistently observed in Carner Barrens East, Madison Avenue Pinelands, the Great Dune area, and the Kings Road Barrens, as well as the Truax Barrens, even though that's not part of the sampling regime. We, the staff, Dylan, Steve, and I, and the volunteers have heard them in the Truax Barrens as well. And this was a bit of a shocker when they first started showing up. Not in my wildest dreams did I think that we would get eastern whippoorwills trying to recolonize this landscape. Best we can tell, they've been absent from the preserve prior to 2007 for at least 20, if not 30 years, based on a wide variety of anecdotal and some empirical data that I've been able to. Including people that live in the pine bushes told me they haven't heard them until recently. And before I transition, I just want to again thank our community scientists. They are amazing people collecting fantastic data that really helps expand our ability to understand what makes this system work and the impacts of our management. And as a result of consistently hearing birds in the preserve, we set out in 2019 to drill in a little bit deeper. So you can see from left to right, there's myself, and then Dylan, and then Steve, and then Tom Williams, who was a seasonal field ornithology technician that's worked with us for a number of years, and a volunteer, and an all-around nice guy. And you can see Steve and I there holding eastern whippoorwills to give you a sense of how big these birds are. So the goals of our research, unlike the community science work, was really about detecting them. Are they there and where are they? And how many birds are folks hearing? Our research really tried to drill down and understand the habitat usage of these birds. There's not a whole lot known beyond the general stuff that I gave you at the beginning when I talked about habitat. They tend to seem to like open canopied sites, particularly sites that are fire managed. And they particularly seem fond of pine barrens and oak savanna. So we set out to try, since we had birds consistently here, and now GPS data loggers and electronic devices have gotten small enough. So we set out, thanks to the help of the Friends of the Pine Bush community, we were able to purchase these transmitters, these 1 gram low-tech pinpoint GPS 10 units. So these are data loggers. And the idea was we would put these data loggers on the birds. So we go out to catch the birds. We play a recording on a speaker in front of a mist net. You see in the lower left there, Dylan extracting an eastern whippoorwill from a mist net. This mist net's a little bit larger than what we typically use for our daytime songbird work because whippoorwills are so large. So we play that recording, and depending on the bird and the night and the wind and an unbelievable amount of luck, we can catch whippoorwills in the net. And it is not quite as easy as we thought it would be, even to catch them the first time. So we play the recording, the whippoorwills, the males will quickly try and repel an intruder once they set up a territory. So, and setting up a territory and calling is a great sign that the birds are trying to attract a mate and reproduce and establish a breeding population. early on when the community scientists were picking up birds, they were clearly just birds that were moving through, we call it prospect, probably males singing for a few weeks early in the season, not finding any females, and we wouldn't hear the males singing for the rest of the season. Beginning in 2015, 2016, 2017, we started hearing birds more consistently throughout the season, which is another reason why we decided to try and tag them. So once we have a bird in the net, again, it's attracted, it's trying to chase out the interloper that it hears, and it gets snared in the net. We extract it, we fit it with a USGS numbered leg band, but we also then put this transmitter on it. And the transmitter, you can see it in the middle of the slide with a penny. And Steve, with his good eyesight, unlike mine, and his great dexterity with his fingers, is able to establish these loops. The loop is made of jewel cord. Ever made jewelry with your kids and use that stretchy plastic cord? That's what that is. The jewel cord is attached to the transmitter, and then basically you're putting pants on a bird. So if you look at the upper right hand illustration, the loop goes over the foot and up the leg. You then wrap it around the back of the bird, holding the transmitter on while you fold the leg in its natural folded position, and then stretch the cord around the other leg and get the transmitter situated. Then you can see the finished product on the right there with between Dylan's thumbs with the transmitter and with the data log. And again, these are data loggers. So that's the other part of this. It turns out to be extremely difficult because, you know, birds are smart. Turns out it's relatively easy to catch a bird the first time. In 2022, when Dylan and Steve went out to initially try and catch a whippoorwill in the Truex Trail Barrens, as dusk settled and the night was getting dark, Dylan played the recording and the bird pretty much landed at her feet, almost hit her in the face as it landed there within minutes of playing the recording. That's the best case scenario. Recatching the birds to get the transmitter off. So these are data loggers. So the data logger GPS, it's transmitting and getting fixes with satellites. We then have to recatch the bird, remove the data logger, and then download the data. So and that's really a function of the weight of the transmitter. There are, of course, GPS transmitters GPS units that trackers that will transmit, and you don't need to remove the device to get the data. But again, with the battery size and the weight of these birds, the transmitters simply aren't that small yet. So in order to do this work, you have to catch the bird twice. Catching the bird twice is unbelievably difficult. Again, you need luck, but then there's wind, and the birds are a little trap smart. We have multiple different whippoorwill songs that we'll play to try and lure them in, because they will recognize the song that got them captured the first time. And we're putting these on and then removing them about 3 to 4 weeks later, ideally, before the birds stop singing. The birds generally stop singing in early to mid-June. So we have to get these on in May and get them off in mid to late June before the birds will stop responding to that playback. And that's called target netting. So the results of our work. So I'll have that share screen. So we have captured now a total of 7 birds, 7 eastern whippoorwills, and we captured 3 in 2019. And 2019 was a real exciting year because this bird that Dylan is holding in the middle slide is actually a female. So the males are attracted to the net because we're playing that recording. So we captured 2 males, put the GPS data loggers on them, went out 3-4 weeks later, trying to recapture those birds. And lo and behold, when we captured the male bird on the left, as we were extracting him from the net, we realized, wait, we have a second whippoorwill in the net. And if you notice the picture that Dylan is with Dylan in the middle, he's holding the tail open. Male birds have very large white patches on their outer tail feathers, like the picture to the right. That's a male tail. The female tail does not. And to boot, we got really excited when we realized that this little girl had a full-blown brood patch. So when birds are sitting on eggs or nestlings, they shed feathers on their bellies and their breasts to increase the contact between the heat of their body and their skin and the eggs and nestlings. But the fact that she had a full-blown brood patch meant that she was actively reproducing. And that's the first first confirmation that we had in the Albany Pine Bush of breeding here in a long, long time. So in 2019, we caught 3 birds, put transmitters on 2 males, recaptured both of those males and this female. In 2020, we did not do any work in 2020 thanks to the pandemic. In 2021, we captured 3 males, put the data loggers on them. Despite an unbelievable amount of effort, we were unable to recapture any of those 3 birds. And we could not find any of those 3 birds in 2022. In 2022, we captured 1 male out in the Kings Road Band. And you can see the dates in the upper right here. So the 2 2019 birds, the transmit was initially captured on June 11th and recaptured on June 24th. And that is based on the research that Andrew Vitz and Maria Benjamins are doing in Massachusetts. Around June 24th, June 25th is pretty much the drop dead date, the last date when you're going to be able to recapture the birds. After that, they're done breeding and they simply will not come to the home. In 2022, this year, we captured that male on May 23rd and recaptured him on June 15th. And this other bird, 33, was captured on June 6th and recaptured on June 19th. And that was a remarkable recapture, and I'll show you why in a second. Each of these birds, the number of fixes. So you can see here the number of fixes, and this is really relevant because the transmitters, the GPS data loggers are not constantly getting a fix on that bird. The way these pinpoint systems work to conserve battery is that I program them with a specific schedule every couple of hours while the thing is deployed to collect a GPS point. This is the first map I'm going to show you, and we're way blown out here. So first, I want to draw your attention to the red line. That's the 13,000 acre Albany Pine Bush study area. Interstate 90 runs through the middle of it. You can see the 87 on the east end of that. And the preserve land is embedded within that. If you look at these colored dots, the green is number 3032. The blue is actually also 3032 because you can, once you remove the data logger, you recharge it, reprogram it, you can deploy it again on another bird. And the orange dots are from 3033, which is the other 2019 bird. And again, you can see the dates there. The GPS fixed schedule for these that I programmed, figure in the summer, right? Sunset is around 8:30 to 9 o'clock, and the birds are active at night. So we set these to get a fix on the bird at 10 p.m., at 1 a.m., and at 4 a.m. every night, and then at noon every other day. And the noon time is particularly important because it suggests where the bird is roosting during the day. And if they're mated, they're going to roost near that, right up, typically above or very close to the female who's sitting on a nest. You can see the number of fixes there for the birds in general, from 46 to 75 fixes. Those are great numbers for the size of these transmitters and how many fixes they can actually collect. And there's a couple of things I want to show you here, and then I'm going to zoom in on the next slide. So if you notice, the green bird, 3032 from 2019, all of his fixes are in a real close proximity. That bird never used much more than 13 hectares of habitat. Had a nice sizable territory. That's also the bird where we captured the female with the brood patch when we recaptured that bird. So clearly this male, we know he had a female, and looks like he had a pretty defined territory. Somewhat similarly in 2022, the blue dots are also relatively tight with a few outliers. And that bird that Steve calculated the minimum convex polygons for the area these birds used based on the fixes that we got. So that the blue bird in 2022, which is also Ag 30, he used about 118 hectares. Well, I want to draw your attention to the yellow bird, this tan bird, because honestly, it is amazing and sheer luck that we were able to recapture this bird and remove his GPS data log. We caught him across the street from the Discovery Center. If you're familiar, there's a big surge point over there from a potable water system that the town of Colony uses. But across the street from the Discovery Center, across from 155 is where we heard him initially, captured him, put the transmitter on. And then 3-4 weeks later, on June 19th, we tried to recapture him. Initially, we started over there, no luck. Then we came over to Carter Barrens East. I think we tried several nights to recapture this bird before we finally did in Carter Barrens East. But in the meantime, this bird spent an awful lot of time in Carter Barrens East, across the street in the edge of Truex Barrens, outside of the preserve in a forested area. And then it flew up to all the way up to Vicious Ferry and spent a couple of nights at several different points at Vicious Ferry, and then went down close to Selkirk and Five Rivers area for a night before coming back to the preserve. We just happened to be there with our speaker playing the song and our net, and happened to recatch him pretty easily, actually, from in Carter Barrens East. And if you zoom in a little bit, one of the things that jumps out, I talked about how we understand their habitat usage generally, that they like open habitat, open canopy habitats. But open canopy habitats. Several researchers have suggested that there may be the story to their habitat usage may be a little more complicated. And if you look at the green bird from 2019, what's interesting is this bird did spend an awful lot of time out in open barrens, but it consistently came back during the day and roosted on the edge of a locust clump. So this is a closed canopy stand of hardwood, not what we would typically think of as eastern whippoorwill habitat. Similarly, the 2022 bird, who spent much of his time in the Truex, this is the blue dots here on the map, spent much of his time when we captured him the first time and recaptured him in pretty open habitat. And in 2021, we had at least 3 birds singing up in this area. But he used spent an awful lot of time out in the open, but also was roosting during the day in a relatively discrete stand of a closed canopy stand of pitch pine. Even the bird the yellow bird from 2019, that didn't seem to, probably this bird did not have a female. We will never know for sure, but he wandered all over the place, but kept coming back to Carter Barrens East behind the Discovery Center and the open habitat across the street, across from 155. But it too frequently went just north of the railroad tracks out of preserve land, roosting during the day in a closed canopy forest. So we suspect, and hopefully we'll be able to get more data over time to drill down into this. But much like a ruffed grouse uses multiple seral stages for multiple life stages in their natural history, we suspect that whippoorwills may be doing something similar. They may like to roost and potentially nest under a little more cover, but they need all that open habitat to feed and catch their moths. So it's an interesting suggestion here that these birds are utilizing both open canopied habitat and some closed canopy stands, and speaks volumes to the need to try and maintain heterogeneity or diversity, variety in the forest cover in the preserve. Yes, pine barrens are generally very open habitats, but that doesn't mean that all these clusters of pitch pine and some hardwood trees and white pine in these ravines shouldn't be left as they are. I thought that was probably one of the more interesting conclusions from our small sample size of these 3 birds. They're using both open canopied and closed canopy habitats. So next steps for us, obviously, we certainly are continually thankful for our community scientists, and we look to continue our community science work, as well as trying to tag more birds and get more data. But also, what you've seen tonight is very preliminary. We really want to drill down. We can look at the timestamps for each of those GPS fixes and look for behavioral cues, evaluate timestamps for habitat use, drill down and look at the timestamps and the impacts of our habitat management. What happens as we mow, burn, thin, keep doing the work that we're doing to restore ecosystem health And we are actively looking for both positive and negative signs. To date, we haven't seen a whole lot of negative signs or indications of our ecosystem management work on any of the species that of greatest conservation need that we're concerned with. But that doesn't mean that they may not show up. So we're monitoring, not just look at our successes, but to learn from failures. And it could be the case for whippoorwills that it's important that we lead, that diversity of canopy cover across the protected lands. And lastly, of course, we're going to continue collaborating with our partners in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire Audubon, and compare notes so we can all keep learning more about these fascinating birds. So in conclusion, eastern whippoorwills are back in the preserve after about a 30-year absence, and clearly at least attempting to breed, even though we may not have a fully fledged source, whippoorwill population yet. We certainly hope that will happen over time. It appears that ecosystem restoration is creating favorable habitat for them, or they wouldn't be here. Whippoorwills are using both managed open habitat and small stands of close canopy forest. They are yet another indicator of improving ecosystem function. So collectively, we've got our daytime birds, we've got whippoorwills, we've got bees, moths, butterflies. We're seeing the distribution and abundance of all those rare species improving over time as we continue to manage the preserve. Whippoorwills remain extremely difficult to study, but highly informative. It is some of the most frustrating and satisfying work that I've done with birds in my tenure at the preserve. It is unbelievably joyful when you actually catch one, let alone when you recatch a bird that has your GPS data logger. Open canopied habitats are disappearing, which makes our work increasingly important for all wildlife of open canopies, but including eastern whippoorwills. And a lot of folks may not fully appreciate this. We think, we tend to have a very European focus on forests and think that, overall, all wildlife needs forests. But the truth is there's a whole bunch of species that need what we call the in-between stage, not a grassland and not a closed canopy forest, but these open canopied savanna-like habitats, like high-quality pitch vine scrub oak barrens, are really the only places many of these species have to persist. And this is, it's what we're doing here locally to combat the biodiversity crisis. I talked about birds declining and how pretty nearly all birds in North America are declining, but that's only the tip of the iceberg on what's been happening with biodiversity and species diversity across the planet. When you have even common species like, little brown bats and robins, numbers declining precipitously, it's really a sign of a much bigger problem. And the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis go hand in hand. And locally, we are doing what we can to try and push back against both of those important issues. And I wanted to leave you here with some parting words from Aldo Leopold, even though I believe this quote he was talking about another species, the American woodcock, but I thought this seemed particularly apropos for tonight's lecture. When we hear his call, we hear no mere bird. We hear the trumpet and the orchestra of evolution. He is the symbol of our untamable past and that incredible sweep of millennia, which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of birds and men. And lastly, I want to acknowledge our community scientists and the New York State Environmental Protection Fund and the Friends of the Pine Bush community for supporting our bird research. And with that, Dylan, I'm going to hand it back to you for the Q&A.
All right. That was amazing, Neil. Thank you so much. What a wonderful story. So first off, your audio of the whippoorwill didn't come through. So I believe if you go and hit share screen, you can also say, if you hit advanced sharing audio,
okay.
You can also share audio, although I'm not seeing it.
I see it.
Wendy was also kind enough. You got it?
Yeah.
So if you see share that and you want to put that slide up again so people can hear the call, it didn't come through the first time.
Don't you like how a whippoorwill looks at night? A whippoorwill at night looks like this.
Yeah.
Let's see if this works, because this is what you see out there at night when you hear road noise, and let's see if this works again. Great. And as I said, it really is, enigmatic. It's one of those nature sounds that, like a loon, the sound of the woods, it's the sound of the wilderness. And that's actually a recording that I made because the bird was literally above me on a branch in the preserve a few years ago. All right, how are we doing, Dylan, for time?
All right. Oh, we're doing great. So we got about 30 minutes now, and we do have some questions in the Q&A. So I'll feed you those, Neil.
Great.
And everybody feel free, if you have questions, to add them right into that Q&A. You'll see them disappear as we go through them. So these are going to cover the whole breadth of your talk, Neil.
Okay.
So Susan asks, are herbicides safe for groundwater?
Ooh, depends on the herbicide. Some are because they bind to the soil and they're not mobile, and some are not. And the one that we use in particular for most of our work does bind to the soil and is not mobile, does not, based on all the information we have. Good question. It actually reminds me what because I couldn't see my notes when we were sharing this tonight online. One of the, there are multiple reasons why whippoorwills have declined and a bunch of birds. One, of course, the biggest one is habitat loss, but in particular, because these birds are particular feeders of moths, there's a whole number, moths are in decline. And there's the wind chill test everybody talks about where, in the 70s and 80s, when you drove around at night, your windshield would be covered in bugs and mostly moths. And today that doesn't really happen anymore. And that's what's feeding these birds. So part of it is habitat loss, part of it is food loss. But part of the reason we don't have as many moths is insects at night is insecticides, but also biocontrol for gypsy moths, to flies and some others. Early on when biocontrol was used to try and control some of these species like gypsy moths, they released flies and other things that have multiple broods a year, while gypsy moths only have one a year, which means all these bugs that were released to control gypsy moths are eating everything else much of the year when gypsy moths are not available.
Okay. Scott says, great program. Thank you. What is your estimate of the number of whippoorwills in the pine bush? And are there plans to expand the survey to additional locations within the pine bush, such as Truax?
Great question, Scott. And I hope you and Denise both are joining us tonight. Are we going to expand the community science survey? If we can get enough community scientists, I think that's a great idea.
We actually did this year. I sent one person out to Truax, so hopefully we will in the future.
And what was the second part of this question? The first part?
How many whippoorwills do we think are in the preserve?
We think it's highly variable, Scott. In 2021 seemed to be a great year. We had at least 3 birds counter singing in Truax and Kings Road Barrens area. We had at least 3 birds in between Madison Avenue and the Great Dune, which is one big block of habitat. And maybe a bird in Cunnerbrand's East Nest Shore. So at most 6 or 7 in the landscape in the best year, but I do think it's highly variable. I don't, and this is, Dylan and Steve could answer this question as well as I could, but the 3 of us don't think that that we have a fully established breeding population yet. We think we have the beginnings of one, or as Dylan once said, we're at the cusp of having a breeding population, which likely means that we've restored appropriate habitat, the house is built, the furniture is in, but there's something else that's driving and influencing whether or not they're successfully breeding here. It could be the availability of females. Typically for most wildlife species, males disperse first and try establishing territories. And so we could have an imbalance between males and females. Clearly one guy got lucky and found a female over in the Great Dune area, but and food availability, light pollution, noise, who knows? The only time will tell, which is exactly why we need to continue doing both the community science and the GPS tagging of these birds, so we can continue to learn more and see what the population does. The nearest other population to us is about 9 miles north of the preserve in the Luther Forest. And over half of their habitat, I believe, was removed when the chip fab manufacturing facilities were built. There's still a few birds up there. So we're hoping that, as we continue to improve the landscape, birds are queuing in on habitat, not just because, they're 13 or 15 hectares that they need, but they're also queuing into the overall landscape. So the more we manage the landscape and restore and maximize the size of barrens that looks like my title slide, we think we will be able to support more birds and establish successful population, but really time will tell. There are an awful lot of factors influencing bird populations that are outside of local.
All right. Penny and Carol both asked, what happens to the transmitter if it isn't retrieved?
Eventually, the jewelry cord does deteriorate and they'll fall. Yeah. We're hoping they still have them. I mean, those three males that we weren't able to catch in 21 or 22, I think we maybe have one more shot, one more summer of attempting to find those birds and get that data. It's still on there if the transmitter is on the bird, but eventually they will. It's a plastic stretchy cord. It deteriorates over time.
Or maybe one of our partners. Maybe they'll end up at one of our partners.
Yes, that would be nice if somebody else recaptures one of our birds elsewhere. And that's our partners in Massachusetts, Drew and Maria, with the Heritage Program, Massachusetts Mass Heritage. They're actually tracking birds both in their breeding grounds, but also they're establishing a GPS. They're using the same exact tag we are, but they're also getting fixes throughout the fall migration and winter, and then recapturing birds the following year.
Janelle says, do you think moth species availability is a deterrent to WIP's breeding grounds or more related to habitat composition and availability?
Yes. So Janelle, I think it's both. I think it can be a limiting factor because of food. And of course, light pollution can dramatically influence the moth population. Tim McCabe. So Tim McCabe did a study years ago looking at moth abundance across the preserve as you get closer and closer to downtown. And we know, Carnarvon is east and out by the landfill, Rapp Road has had the moth diversity and abundance goes down. So that's certainly a factor. We have done moth surveys with graduate students and contractors, and the moth diversity and abundance in the preserve still appears to be quite high. So there are certainly fewer of the giant silk moths. That's what folks think whippoorwill is primarily fed upon, where the lutemoths and the cecropias and the ios. But there are lots of other smaller moths that are still in the preserve that should be able to.
All right. Ed caught you a little bit. He noticed that you had two different Latin names for the birds early in the slides.
Nice attention to detail. Yeah, they changed the genus name.
Fairly recently, right?
Yes, I was surprised. I fixed many of these slides just in the last couple of weeks when I went to All About Birds and realized that they had they changed the genus name. Similarly, the Cardinal Blue genus has changed. So it happens. Taxonomists need to have job security as well.
Ronald says, does the whippoorwill only feed while seated, or can they feed while in flight?
They will do both, but from what I could tell through everybody else's research, they're principally flycatchers, but they can fly, take flights to catch moths and, catch moths on the wing as they're flying. So it's a little bit of both, but we think it's principally that they're sitting on branches and flying out and catching.
Joe says, are whippoorwill able to ground nest near active footpaths? How close can they tolerate people or pets afoot or on bicycles?
Great question. Based on the nests that our counterparts in the Montague pine barrens, Montague pine plains have found, they did find nests relatively close to footpaths. So they will nest on the ground, relatively close. But that's a great question. And as you can imagine, finding whippoorwill nests to be able to answer that question is unbelievable. Mike spent what, 5 years in Montague studying prairie warblers, where all they did pretty much every day all summer was walk around in habitat like what you see in that picture, searching for prairie warbler nests, and in the process found nests of lots of other species, including a few whippoorwills. So just dumb luck. Or good luck, I should say. Good luck.
Someone's asks, do I understand that spongy moths are a food source for these guys?
I would think they would be. I don't see why not. They're big enough. But I don't know. I honestly don't have the answer. I cannot imagine that these guys and girls are specialists on any one species. Size of the moth seems to be important based on some of the literature, which is why we think they largely used to feed on highly abundant giant silk moths. That the biocontrol for gypsy moths is pretty much like that.
Susan asks, do you time the prescribed burns around the nesting brooding times of the whippoorwill and other birds and animals?
Yes and no. So we are managing habitat, and we will burn throughout the year when conditions are appropriate. We only get at most of about 18 burn days in a given year. More important, so to make sure that we are protecting wildlife, because we do burn at all times of the year, we always leave plenty of refugia. So in any given section of the preserve, we don't treat more than a third of any section in any year to make sure that there's plenty of untreated habitat every year. That's a great question, and it's the push-pull and double-edged sword of our conservation work, in particular because we know historically growing season or breeding season fires happen, and breeding season fires have a whole different set of impacts on the plants and the habitat in a good way than burning in the dormant season like this time of year or in the spring and fall when all the plants are asleep basically and all their reserves are in their roots. But we can balance that by making sure that we're not managing too much too quickly during the breeding season. It's a great question, great thought.
And kind of more towards that management piece, Matt asks, are there APB ecosystem management practices that can help to offset the consequences of climate change?
Ask me that again.
Matt asked if there are, hang on, I gotta go back to it. If there are management techniques at the ABBP that can be used to offset the consequence of climate change.
Yes. So one of them, of course, is simply building the preserve, setting aside and permanently protecting, ultimately 5,380 acres goal. We're at 3,400 acres now. That makes sure that we have all those plants, during the growing season that are sucking up CO2 and putting out oxygen. So that certainly is a step in the right direction locally for protecting managing climate change. Interestingly, whole bunch of research around this related to prescribed fire and burning relatively frequent, low intensity, low severity fires like the ones that we have, provided you're leaving enough space between burns for the plants to regrow, actually is a net negative for CO2 production. So basically, if we're doing it right, even though we're burning and putting CO2 and other gases in the air, we're managing the habitat to make sure that all those plants are there to effectively remove carbon. So the net balance is in our favor. Unlike, for example, wildfires, if you weren't burning here, and pine barrens, just like what you see out west, they're fire dependent, fire adapted habitats, ecosystems, they will eventually burn. Those mega fires out west, that's an example where you're getting one big fire that's releasing a ridiculous amount of greenhouse gases that will take centuries to resequester, versus the kind of burning that we're doing in a maintenance phase and managing the pine barrens here. But it's the same is true for all the places that are using prescribed fire frequently, but having frequent low intensity fire. It's actually sequestering more carbon than is released. So that's a great question. Outside of that, I'm not sure. I think the other piece, that for us in utilizing the preserve to combat climate change is that it is a local example. So the educational piece of that question, I think, is critically important. It's a place where people can come and visit and recreate, but also learn about conservation and how conservation of open space helps not only protect wildlife and rare plants, but also can help teach about biodiversity and combating climate.
Penny asks, what eats whippoorwills?
What eats whippoorwills? Well, as a ground nester, all kinds of things. So I imagine that there are a number of avian predators like hawks and owls that would eat whippoorwill. Mammal predators, of course, gray fox and coyotes, and if they can find them, particularly eggs and hatchlings, I'm sure they get eaten. But probably, given that they nest in the ground in a landscape like ours, house cats, I think, would be a huge factor. And house cats are the #1 killer of wild birds by far. It's in the billions in North America alone. It's house cats, and then windows, and then, but before you start getting like natural causes of death for birds, like diseases and natural predation. Yeah, I'm sure there are a bunch of things that would eat whippoorwill. Which is why they're so well camouflaged. You pretty much have to be standing on top of them during the day when they're roosting to see them, because they blend in that way.
Barbara asks, what's the best time of night to hear them?
Ooh, great question. Right after sunset and right before sunrise, really. And typically our survey for the community science work is the moon has to be visible, has to be visible and at least half illuminated. The birds definitely are more active when the moon is bright. The downside of a full moon for us with our netting is that they can more easily see the net. So we try and avoid the full moon when we're doing our work, but anytime the moon is up and visible is the best time to hear them. But usually it's right after sunrise, and just right after sunset, and right before sun. And it's funny. So the place I study them up in the Altona Flat Rock, the Jack Pine Barrens, north of Plattsburgh, when I was in grad school, as soon as that sun, I would get there early before doing my daytime bird work, trying to catch whippoorwills. And as soon as that sun is barely cresting the horizon, they shut off like a switch.
Ronald is asking why we measure the area in hectares versus acres. Maybe Steve wants to take that one.
Steve can take that if he wants to, but basically in science we try and use metric, and metric for 8 units of area is hectares, and a hectare is 2.471 acres. So the English system is pounds and acres and feet, and the metric system, of course, is meters and kilometers and hectares. And the fact, I'm sure Steve was cringing at the fact that I used both in this presentation. and we used both inconsistent. If I had consistently used both, that would be a different story. I'll work on it. Thank you for noticing.
He also asks, how long do whippoorwills live?
Good question. The research I did, the longest lived whippoorwill was 13 and 15 years old. Most of them probably don't live quite that long, but the more we're banding birds, all birds, daytime birds, prairie warblers, all kinds of blue jays. We just we were looking at bird banding data yesterday with our volunteer, phenomenal person, Jane Tatlock, retired engineer from TV. And Jane pointed out that one of the blue jays we caught this year was 11 years old. Now, so birds can live a lot longer. Most songbirds don't live more than 3 or 5 years, but if they make it to 3 or 5, the chances they'll live, 9 or 10. Okay.
What is the largest population of whippoorwills the preserve could sustain?
Great question. We have no idea, because carrying capacity is driven not only by available habitat, but available food. And the predation pressure and disease pressure and all of that is influencing how many birds can fit in a given area. I don't know. I'd love to think a couple of dozen. Given this, a smaller area in the Jack Pine Barrens where I did my work, there are dozens and dozens. So the Altona Flat Rock, the area around the Watertown fort, the military installation around Watertown, and Long Island are the 3 big hotspots for whippoorwill. We can find lots of them. Long Island Pine Barrens in Altona, and around the why am I gapping on the name of the military? But they also manage awful lot of habitat up there at the military reservation, the military installation. If you look at it through satellite imagery, it's open canopy like this picture. It's a very large open canopy.
Okay, Janelle says, I can't find any audio for whip growling when they are territorial. Do you use this call when call baiting? And we know where she could listen to it?
I didn't even know about that, Janelle. So no, that's news to me. We have not used that. We have multiple versions of singing male whippoorwills that we got from the Macaulay Library, Matt Medler and the folks at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. But no, I'm not familiar with the growling.
Xenocanto is another good place to find audio recordings. It's kind of community science based, but that's a good place to listen to a bunch. We've used them from there. Oh, Mary Beth piped in Fort Drum.
Fort Drum, thank you, Mary Beth.
Matt says, COVID seemed to drive more folks to participate in outdoor activities like hiking. As we continue to promote APB trail usage by the public, could that increased human activity negatively impact the viability of rare species like the whippoorwill?
Yes. Part of the reason why we monitor wildlife and look at the population trends over time. And this year, actually, we just started in the fall. We established camouflage trail counters at pretty much all of the trailheads so that we can actually monitor statistically trail usage and start pairing that up with our wildlife data to begin looking at some of those things. Yeah, there's no camera in these things. It's simply just a sensor that counts every time a person walks by. But it will allow us to start asking and answering some of those kinds of questions. But yeah, it's a double-edged sword. Use definitely has an impact. It's part of the reason why we went through a pretty massive trail reconstruction process in 2010. So we have in our management plan, we have a resource protection and visitor experience plan that looked at, and we realized as a result of that, every trail has a zone of influence. So when we applied the zone of influence, which for us we determined to be 75 meters in either direction or 150 meter swath around the trail, we had an awful lot of trails in places like Hunter Burns East and some of our highest quality habitat that were so close together, the zones of influence overlapped, and there really was no core habitat unaffected by trail users. So part of the reason why we closed a bunch of internal trails, moved some trails more toward the outskirts of each fragment of the preserve, was to try and better balance visitor experience with resource protection so that wildlife can be wild, not necessarily constantly influenced by people going up and down the trail. At the same time, of course, we want the trails to be open and give people a good experience. So, you know, it's a push-pull there and a balancing act. But overall, we ended up actually increasing the miles of trails in the preserve while simultaneously dramatically increasing the amount of core habitat that was unaffected by trails. And you can look at that. It's on the commission's website. You can look at the recreation plan and see those maps, see how and why we reconstructed the trails the way we did.
Sorry, I'm looking something up.
Okay. Do you have any more questions?
Yes. So Scott just asked when the community science whippoorwill survey training is. And that is
a question for Dylan.
Yeah,
Oh,
that
yeah.
is Wednesday, May 10th. We'll need to check the website. I think Scott says there's a mix-up on the website between woodcock and whippoorwill monitoring training. So the whippoorwill is May 10th.
Okay.
Otherwise, I think that's all the questions in the Q&A.
Great.
If anybody has any last minute questions while we're wrapping up here.
Do you or Steve have anything you want to add? I mean, I'm the PI on this project, but it's quite frankly equally belongs to all three of us. So you have as much invested in this as I do. You guys have something you want to add, please do.
I think you did a great job covering our work, Steve.
I was gonna say, can we tell them to be on the lookout for an article coming?
No, not yet.
Okay.
But you just did. In a popular,
didn't.
in a popular magazine put out by the Department of Environmental.
All right. Well, you're getting a lot of kudos in the Q&A too.
Good.
So thank you everybody so much for attending.
I know there was more I wanted to say, but I couldn't see my notes. So glad everybody got something good on this. I want to thank Dylan and Jeff and the Friends of the Pine Bush community for hosting the science lecture series. It is a tremendous addition and awesome asset of what the commission and the Friends can do together. But also, it's always a great opportunity for me to speak to not only going to conferences and whatnot, but talking to people that are using and loving this place for what it is. It's a place that is near and dear to me. Pine Barrens have always held a special place in my heart, and it's a privilege to be able to work to conserve this place and share it with all of you.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, and be sure to tune in March for Jeff's talk. March 16th, right, Jeff?
That's right. That's what we have on our calendar.
All right. And hopefully the weather will smarten up by then. So you'll be able to come and see Jeff speak in person at the Discovery Center. Or if you'd prefer, or you're out of town, you can, it will be live streamed on our YouTube channel. So, all right. Thanks, everybody.